Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at Xtalks.com, and this week I'm delighted to introduce a very special guest on the show. We have with us today Dr. Steffen-Sebastian Bolz, a scientist, physician, and entrepreneur. He's a co-founder of Aphaia Pharma, as well as founder and chief scientific and medical officer at Qanatpharma. Dr. Bolz holds a full professorship at the University of Toronto, is a principal investigator at the Ted Rogers Centre for Heart Research, and is also director of the Toronto Centre for Microvascular Medicine. Aphaia Pharma is developing innovative non-hormonal treatments for metabolic conditions like diabetes and obesity. The company is focused on restoring a normal metabolic food response through natural and safe treatment alternatives that can be applied to broad populations and enable long-term use. So to learn more about this very exciting novel approach to treating conditions like obesity and diabetes, let's turn to Dr. Bolz now. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
So Dr. Bolz, I'd like to first start off by asking you about Aphaia Pharma in terms of what the core mission and goals of the company are. And also we were talking backstage about the name Aphaia, and it would be wonderful if you could shed some light on the origins of that and also how the company came to be as well.
Oh, my pleasure. So maybe the name first, because it might sound a little unusual, and it is kind of unusual, and the story behind it is almost funny. So when you look for a name for a company, you try to be fancy somehow, and we had many things going back and forth. And one very safe haven for these thoughts is always the Greek language, kind of something antique and whatever. So we kind of were in this room when a friend, a co-founder of mine, actually was on a ferry in the Aegean Sea and just said, "Well, I'm just passing by this island called Aphaia." I said, "Well, that's a cool name. And that's an island where there's one temple, and that's the only temple where the goddess of fire is worshipped. And the goddess of fire is the goddess of twilight and of dawn." So somehow that was appealing. We thought, hey, let's do it. And so then you do the search, and we found that no one else had Aphaia as a name, and Aphaia not mentioned Aphaia Pharma. And this is how it came together and came to be. And this is how we got to the name. Then before we actually found ourselves in the situation that we needed a name, we needed to put the company together. And the company story is also somewhat unusual because, as you mentioned before, my main job at that time was being, and still is a full professorship at the University of Toronto. I do my research there in the microvascular space. I have my book there and everything. And a friend of mine runs a boutique investment company here in Germany, and he kind of alerted me to this idea and asked me what I thought about it. And I thought the idea was cool because essentially what was presented to us at that time is that you could treat diabetes with sugar. And that was weird enough to catch my interest. And as we might discuss later, if you work in Toronto, if you walk through Toronto or across the campus in Toronto, it's absolutely inevitable that you bump into my very nice colleagues who work on GLP-1 or one of the other incretins. So I was kind of my mind was preset for this. And so unfortunately, the team that had a very rudimentary idea about this disassembled, and my friend and I thought we have to pursue this. And the first thing we did is we found the committed investors because we needed someone to buy into this and kind of embark on this everything but certain trip. And we found those investors, which are still with us, which are still funding everything we do, and started the company. And the first thing we wanted to show is, and that goes a little bit into the mechanism, is that you can really use sugar to treat the metabolic disease. And that's how it came together, and that's how we started.
That's indeed a great story, and also the concept of using sugar to treat diabetes. It's definitely something we want to learn more about. And it just seems, very, in the landscape of GLP-1 drugs and hormonal treatments, definitely it's wonderful to be pursuing something that is just slightly different. But so we're really excited to learn more about that. And could you tell us more about Aphaia Pharma's approach and how you took this concept to treat diabetes with sugar or glucose and developing it into therapies for obesity and diabetes?
Yeah, so I think the primary goal has always been for Aphaia to treat metabolic disease by using the body's own resources to restore what we then call metabolic balance. Because we thought if we can restore health in the metabolic system, specifically in those nutrient-sensing cells in the distal small intestine, if we can restore health there, normal functioning, then we should release all the hormones that these cells usually produce, and it should be safe. Because whatever it would do would be integrated in the huge hormonal feedback, very complex feedback loops. So for an overdose, for example. That has always been the idea from the outset to try this. And what the approach is based on, and I come from the Department of Physiology and have been a physiologist for most of my life. So I was actually trained, on my perspective has always been to understand the mechanism first. And what we can say, and what we can confidently say is that with all the work that has been done, actually a large deal has been done in Toronto by Dan Drucker, by Ted Brubaker, by many other colleagues. They provide us with very detailed understanding of the mechanisms through which the small intestine can actually control food intake, energy expenditure, behavior, and so on. And actually what I would like to make very clear here, the small cells in the distal small intestine control brain functions. They control behavior. We now call it the gut-brain axis, which is more and more coming together as a fascinating concept.
Right, exactly.
And we wanted to use this because we started to understand how those functions are compromised by metabolic diseases. And the mission of Aphaia Pharma has been to correct these functions, which this mechanism-based approach, which is safe and can therefore be made accessible to large patient groups. And not only the patients groups we're treating today, but also elderly, children, patients with a BMI that is not necessarily above 30 or above 27, together with medical conditions, which is now the threshold for prescription. We want to make this accessible to broader groups because it's safe, it may be even more accessible. That has always been the idea. Whether we get there, we will see, but that has been the mission. And what I can say so far, and kind of as a lead-in, is that our phase 1 and phase 2 trials consistently show very benign adverse effect profiles, and that actually encourages the use of our APHD-012, that's the name of our compound, to permanently restore metabolic balance and actually have something like a long-term effective weight management. And what I would say, based on also kind of what you said in your question, in your lead-in, is it's a non-hormonal treatment which actually uses hormones which are in the body. And so it's a very distinct mechanism of action, and it's a new class of drugs that we're creating here. And it will actually help us to treat obesity and several other metabolic diseases. So in our phase 2 trial, which is going to end this year, going to be completed this year, we're not only looking for obesity, we're also looking for type 2 diabetes, we're looking for FLD NASH signals, we're looking for metabolic syndrome data. But we also look at the release of hormones. We actually measure the release of hormones at different time points in those patients who are being treated. Compare this to placebo-treated patients, of course. But the question there is very obvious. Do we improve the release over time? Do they release more? Can we kind of restore a healthier release? And all those questions we can actually tackle because we have this technology to trigger these cells. And because you mentioned this before, your colleague actually mentioned that I used an analogy, because another colleague of yours in another interview asked me to kind of come up with a metaphor. And I think there's a very easy one. If you think about those nutrient-sensing cells, Sleeping Beauty, APHD-12 is the knight in shining armor or the prince or whatever that kisses them awake. That's the whole idea, right? To bring them back to normal functioning and harvest or exploit the broad metabolic impact.
And so it sounds like if you have these nutrient sensing cells, they might be, let's say, dormant or sleeping beauty. So the idea is to stimulate for them to wake up or to function more effectively. Is that the idea behind, let's say, your lead candidate and its mechanism of action?
Probably all of the above, and we don't know yet, because we have to analyze the data. But what we know is that obesity and other metabolic diseases are associated with reduced levels of all those hormones. This is why metabolic control is compromised. And current obesity drugs like incretin agonists address this, but just with a very small part of the deficiency, because we're talking about dozens of hormones, and incretin agonists replace 1 or 2 or 3 with a classical hormone replacement approach. So it's a very different idea that works and creates a lot of patient benefit. But we're different. We're trying to actually get in much broader. And we try to, as I said before, we have designed this glucose formulation to actually stimulate these cells to do at least 2 things. The first one is to trigger this release of hormones. But what's known is that if those cells, at least in culture, are deprived from contact to stimulants like glucose or peptides or lipids, they reduce the expression of the GP, so the G protein receptors and the glucose transporters over time. So what might very well happen, we might find indications in our data that we not only trigger a system that's not at full capacity, but then we also restore full capacity without treatment. And that would be the hope. And we would see this when we when we look at the development of the hormone release in every patient. We might see, that would be the hope, and that would be true almost, but we might see an improvement over time. And that would actually then support the idea that we not only trigger something, but that we also help rebuilding the infrastructure, which would make a lot of sense for what we know about these cells. And maybe a few words why we kind of honed in on glucose. When you look at the molecular apparatus that sends nutrients, then there are the G protein receptors that actually sense sucrose, sucralose, peptides, and lipids, and they're linked to either phospholipase C pathways or adenylate cyclase pathways, which converge on intracellular stores to release calcium. This signal is necessarily smaller because the capacity of the intracellular calcium stores is limited. This is why we thought, let's take glucose, because you have 2 high-capacity transporters that transport glucose into the cell, which then deprives the cell to generate a calcium influx that creates a massive signal to lead to this release of hormones. So this is why we chose glucose. And I'm very happy with the choice because we get very sufficient hormone release, as we saw in our phase 1 study, which is the release that we see. The amplitude is with the dose we chose absolutely comparable to a normal meal. We can go a little higher if we wanted to, but there's a ceiling effect, obviously so. But it's a normal meal, but it's a little prolonged because the way we present the glucose is more sustainable than just a meal, which is then emptied into the colon. So we're actually quite happy. The area under the curve is larger than with a normal meal. So, and this helps to generate the effect that we're starting to see in our phase 2 studies. Maybe as an introduction here, because I said before that what we do here is when we release these hormones into concerted effort, when they are co-released, we inherently rebuild this complex interaction network that actually enables these hormones in concert to exert effective and precise metabolic control. So we're very, very positive that it will not only work, we've already shown this, but it's also going to remain safe. And that's what we're also seeing in our data.
And you also mentioned that there's growing evidence and research into the area of the gut really being the center of a lot of physiological functions in the body. So the gut-mind connection and all of that. So do you think that by applying this kind of approach, you may also potentially be able to treat other diseases. And I know you did touch on that.
I'm hoping that this will be possible.
Oh.
So if you, and something can be deducted from what we know about this part of the small intestine. This part of the small intestine is densely innervated with vagal efforts. So these fibers actually add glucose right under those cells and project directly into different brain centers. And interestingly enough, different parts of the distal small intestine project to different brain centers. And what we can now do, we can use our technology, we have started to do this. We can use this technology that allows us a very precise targeting of very precisely defined areas in the distal small intestine to actually tell what is being triggered in the brain, to keep it very simple. So we actually, the first attempt we're following now is to map the surface of the small intestine and with regard to its connections to the brain. And inherently that means, it's known that these centers project into, or these fibers project into brain centers that control homeostasis, satiety and hunger. But they also project into higher brain centers that control craving behavior. So very complex behaviors. Addiction is known to be there. Mood change or control of mood is actually located there. So right now, sitting where we are, or being at the point we are right now, we can actually hope that we, at some nice day, we will be able to very precisely target those fibers and see whether it has an effect. But I very much like your question about, because it conceptualized this already, that this can be used now in a very new and maybe innovative way to take advantage of the fact that the small intestine really controls brain functions. And there is a clear correlation between obesity, metabolic disease, and the incidence of Parkinson, or the onset of Parkinson's disease, which is obviously a neurological disease. The connections are also many theories about the connections between the small intestine and the brain by those fibers, and that this is actually linked to the function of those fibers, and maybe this could also be affected. So we have, I can disclose this, we have very broadly protected all those indications, because we hope that we will kind of fill this with life at some point, but we are relatively early in the process. We now are able to show that, and that's the completed phase 2 study that we just completed, analyzed, that we can improve the pathological glucose tolerance in a pre-diabetic population, which would then actually be very valuable to prevent the progression to diabetes, and a preventative approach. As you know, a high percentage of patients with pre-diabetes progresses to diabetes within a year, depending on sex, age, and comorbidities, and so on. So we might actually delay this. Our data, we use the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance, as a surrogate parameter, suggests that this could be working. And our obesity data and our metabolic data from the second trial will give us a very good idea about how we can affect those metabolic parameters. The next step in the pipeline is to then exploit everything beyond this, and diseases like Parkinson, maybe even Alzheimer's, and so on.
That's very interesting that this could be used to potentially prevent diabetes or obesity. So that's actually very, very exciting, because I think a lot of treatments they come in after the disease is already developed. So that's a very, very exciting angle to this approach, indeed. And so,
yeah, and if I may add to this, sorry for interrupting you, because there's a podcast and sometimes it's about stories. This is also an interesting story, because when we did the IND discussions, we're involved in the IND discussions for this obesity trial, which we now call the obesity trial with the FDA. Mm-hmm. They actually looked at our phase 1 data and said, you could actually be preventative. They said, what? And they said, well, why don't you do a pre-diabetes trial? So it was not necessarily our idea. It actually came from the authorities.
Really? Wow.
And was actually neat. So it was only like you get the minutes these days. You don't have to discuss anymore. You only get the minutes from the pre-ID meetings. And that was very clearly stated. You should consider. And so we considered, and it's working. So it was not necessarily on our docket, but we did it, and it works.
That's awesome. And I think, I wanted to ask also about the regulatory side of things, because the science, of course, is there, but then how do you navigate the regulatory end? And so this is a great segue into that question where you met with the through your IND submission, you received that feedback from the FDA. So how are those conversations, and when should they be had? We hear a lot about so many different regulatory changes and things happening. So how do you keep on top of that, and how do you navigate the regulatory end of bringing a drug to market?
That is something that you outsource. We were very, very lucky to have had very, very good consultants. I don't know whether this is the common routine in a podcast, but we had a US company called Qanatpharma, also based in Germany. They were fantastic with just helping us putting this together. Not only the study protocol and everything that's necessary there, all the documents you need to find from our phase 1 study, which indicated that this is a safe treatment, that hormones are really being released. But it also helped us about how to construct this trial, how to go into how to kind of develop or conceptualize a protocol where we can collect data on type 2 diabetes in a subgroup, NAFLD and NASH, and metabolic syndrome, and how this could be done. And it was actually an idea of a consultant, or one of our consultants said, why don't we take obesity as the umbrella? And that's actually what's happening now in the obesity landscape. Everything is now linked to obesity. It's understood that obesity is a prequel to all those other diseases like type 2 diabetes, NAFLD, NASH, cardiovascular disease. And this is why we see when you treat obesity, you have this wonderful benefits, not only weight loss, not only restoration of a normal glucose tolerance, but also cardiovascular benefits. Massive cardiovascular benefits are coming out of the incretin trials now, which is also encouraging for us, because I think we can do the same on a different scale or whatever, but we can, in principle, we can do it. And so I think that this is what you need. You need help. So as a small biotech, and with our backgrounds, we are not necessarily that worse to do it yourself. So we had this help. We also have the other company I'm part of. We have a fantastic intrinsic, a fantastic company from Mississauga, right next door from where we are. And so those colleagues are pivotal for putting this together. So this is important. And you need good data. So you need to build your case very, very clearly and coherently and concisely. And that means that you have to show the risks of your treatment, because the regulatory agencies, for good reason, and rightly so, are all about risk mitigation. And so what we did is we presented a very crystal clean data set where we could show that we are safe. And based on the mechanism of action, it was clear that this should be safe. And this is why when I talk about this, is a little unusual. It was very easy. So those were the most adequate discussions I ever had with the FDA. But when you go in with a different drug, with a new chemical entity or a new incretin agonist, it's much more difficult. And what's happening now in the obesity landscape is that there are good and established treatments like Wegovy, like tirzepatide and Wegovy, semaglutide and tirzepatide, so mono and dual agonists, they're established. And now if you go in there, you actually have to be either different mechanism of action, or you have to be superior, and all these kind of things, which then leads to developments which follow this Olympic model, kind of higher, stronger, faster, which is not necessarily good. I don't think that it's advisable or desirable even to hand around the weight in the least amount of time. This is completely unphysiological. And this is why we see the side effects. And absolutely convinced that this is not the way it should be. We don't gain weight over time, and we shouldn't lose it over time. This is what our physiology, biochemistry is not made for. So I think that this has to be kind of lived through, I guess, but I hope that we come to terms at some point and get apply more common sense and say, okay, we can expand this weight loss over time. We don't need to hammer it down, because right now, in order to be superior, the metrics are weight loss over time. So they try to be faster and faster. Well, this is a challenge, I guess, and also a regulatory challenge. And yeah, the other thing, regulatory wise, which I think we might have an advantage too, or I think we have an advantage, is the accessibility of certain patient groups. So we talk about obese patients. An obese patient, and those patients are actually eligible to receive Wegovy or tirzepatide or whatever. They must have a BMI of 30 or higher, or 27 plus a clinical condition. That's the threshold for a prescription, or to get a prescription, if there is drug available. That's the other problem that still needs to be solved. But this is what it's being stated and being practiced. What about all the patients between a normal BMI and 27 or 30? Mm-hmm. Those patients who are on the way to become obese. What about the kids under 6, which have no treatment, but who are obese? I mean, if you look at the kids in larger cities, also kind of in certain parts of the US, mm-hmm. they are massively obese. And we know this. We know that kids are obese, and they carry the risk to remain obese into adulthood. So they feed the pipeline. We know from militaries and from the military and everywhere, people get more obese and more obese every year. So we should interfere with this development very early on with the children, which are not accessible at this point in time. It's another metaphor. If you ask the fire worker, when should I start kind of fighting the fire? Then he would say as early as possible, as long as the fire is small. It's much more difficult to put fire out if the whole house is on fire. Mm-hmm. So, and this is the beauty of prevention, or even of treating earlier, right? So I think this is, regulatory wise, it's very difficult to get there for many reasons. But maybe the treatment, as we try to advise it will be possible. It might also be easier from a revenue point of view. That's our ambition. That's our mission. I said this before, and that's also our goal now, to make our drug, once we've shown that it's effective and once we can quantify it very precisely, and I think we will, that we make this assessment to larger patient groups. Exactly those I talked about, in addition to those which already benefit, because I think we have to start earlier. It makes a lot of sense from a medical perspective, from an economic perspective. And I think there are only a few things that are as available on this planet as sugar, right? So I think, we apply a few traits to glucose before it's our formulation, but we don't face the same bottlenecks and shortcomings of shortcomings as the drugs which are currently being used. So maybe it's a perspective. So
yeah, definitely a lot of different edges that I think this approach has, and supply chain and supply issues are actually at the forefront as well, because with the GLP-1 drugs and the massive popularity thanks to social media and celebrities and all of that, they've been grappling with supply chain and shortages. So that's a great point, where glucose, it's so ubiquitous, and that's something that Aphaia probably won't run into supply wise from that angle. So that's a great point. And
we have far too much.
Sorry,
we have far too much of it. So we have far too much sugar on this planet. So let's do something good with it.
Exactly. So, and I think, do you think also public perception might also be more positive towards something like this? Because I think the general public usually is looking for more natural alternatives, or for more treatments that are non-hormonal, and I know the GLP-1 drugs have their own space now, but I think this is actually a really big positive where people are usually looking for treatments that may not be so synthetic in nature or so far off from one's natural physiology.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very good point, a great question, because that's exactly how we started. We wanted to follow this idea to just use, if I may say it that bluntly, use nature, right? So this is, and whether the acceptance will be higher is yet to be tested. We don't have data on this now, but what we know is that the patients in our studies tolerate the intake and everything around this formulation extremely well. Mm-hmm. We had instances where in Georgia, where neighbors came to the study nurse and wanted to be enrolled because it's obviously easy to take and safe. So all those funny things, but we have to test what the acceptance is going to be, and this will be linked to the usual metrics. How much can get done in which time frame? And we're playing with different dose regimes. We have kind of updated our study to integrate circadian rhythmicity and circadian principles into the dosing regime, which seems to be quite effective. So we're doing all these things to offer something that is competitive, even when you look at the quantity. But at the same time, I can only repeat what is very important is that when we apply a natural principle, that we're cognizant of the fact that it might not get to these artificially driven massive weight losses over a short amount of time. And that's good. It's good that it doesn't. But this is something we need to kind of infuse into the discussion from our side. But I think people are ready for this. There are very, very recent surveys and interviews of patient groups, and the primary thing, 40% of the patients, and actually another study, more than 40%, wished for less side effects. They said that they would do whatever it takes to get their hands on something that has no side effects, because they suffered from the side effects. And that's understandable. And in the long run, it affects patient compliance. And just to be very clear, and you said it yourself, rightly so, the GLP-1 agonists, the dual agonists, have their place. They yield a massive clinical benefit. This is good stuff. I'm not trying to argue against this, but they also have their downsides, and we've discussed a few of them. And I think this problem is so big that we should integrate different approaches in trying to fight obesity. And so I think this is where there will be patient groups, elderly, very young patients who are not above 30, that might be very well served without treatment. Even those who are above 30, absolutely, because all our patients in our trials are above 30. It's an inclusion criteria, and they benefit as much as we can see in the still blinded data. They benefit quite a bit. So I think that the patient groups and the community of obese patients is ready for this. And I think it can be, and we're doing it right now, you and I, it can be publicized, and we can try to explain it, and we can try to explain what the advantages are, and let's see what happens. So that is where we're on the game right now, starting from, hey, let's try it, to thinking about how can we get to as many patients as possible. That's a nice problem to have.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice problem to have indeed. And so what are some of the upcoming milestones? I know that you mentioned you'll have readouts from the phase 2 trial towards the end of this year. And yes. What's next in the books for, and then moving on to phase 3, of course.
We are moving on to phase 3. Once we have the readouts of all 3 trials, so 1 phase 1, 2 phase 2 trials in our hands, it's an obvious point where we will think and actively pursue partnering. So because with everything we've said before, with the very broad applicability that we see here and that materializes out of the data that we collect in our trials, you can't do this alone as a small biotech. There's absolutely no way that you can even do a fraction of what could be done. So
scale up.
To scale up, but also to scale up with regard to obesity treatments, maybe type 2 diabetes and the usual things. But we also talked about additional therapeutic principles that might actually emerge from all our data, from what we see is happening there. We need a strong partner who shares the vision and then who takes over and takes over or kind of partners in a way that we do things together. This is now a point where we need to make this next step. And this is very exciting. I think this year, towards the end of this year and early next year will be very, very interesting and exciting. And I think if we were to talk next year at the same time, I would have a lot of answers to that point.
Well, we look forward to that indeed, and hope we can have another conversation at that point. And I think just to round off, as a scientist, as a physician in the field, how do you think the landscape of metabolic disease has evolved over the years, over your time in the field? And what changes do you see in the next 5-10 years or so? Also, with the advent of new technologies allowing for greater insights into the biology and physiology of these diseases.
Yes. So what I will purposefully do, I will leave aside the AI part because this is everywhere these days.
It's everywhere.
And it's obvious that we will use algorithms and AI-based models to analyze this massive data network that we're collecting to see patterns that you couldn't see with conventional methods. So we're prepared to do this, and of course we will do this, and that is what other people do as well. Of course, I mean nobody. It's a crystal ball question. I mean, nobody can know at this point what AI will what kind of changes will arise or result from the application of AI-based methods. I think it's going to be rapid. It's going to be very fast. We see the generative AI, and we're using this on the other company. Generative AI can actually shorten the drug development phase from 12 years to 18 months. I mean, their examples are being published just recently that document exactly that, from conceptualizing an NCE to phase 2 in 18 months. This is completely crazy. But this will happen. To what extent this will affect the obesity landscape, the metabolic disease landscape, I don't know. What I know is when you look at how all these agonists are being built, now I think that's the right word, how they're being built, how they're being conceptualized, so double agonists, triple agonists, and so on. I'm absolutely convinced that generative drug design would help there. So we will see something coming out of that corner. But what I think is even more exciting is that there are new, not technologies, but also principles coming online. They come out of stealth mode right now. So there is a company that I met with a few months ago in London at the NSX conference, or that I sat on a panel there, and they actually talked about hibernation. They talk about squirrels, throughout the very well known. They talk about squirrels, the hibernate, or the other mammals. And what one kind of knows is that these hibernating mammals tend to wake up for just a few minutes or even hours, and then they go back to sleep. Metabolically, this is a Hail Mary operation, right? Because you need to go from complete hibernation into activity and back. And what this company does, in very simple terms, and hopefully they forgive me for being so simple, but they analyze what's happening there. Mm-hmm. And it's incredible what can be found there, and how this, it's almost obvious. It presents itself as applicable to the metabolic problem. So we will see, and there were other fascinating things. We will see a lot coming out of those new principles. I think that's going to be very exciting. And as I said before, we will have to put all these things together to actually fight this large scale problem. And of course, besides the incretin agonists, there are other principles that are being attacked, other hormones in the metabolic system that are being emulated and actually built as a drug or formulated as a drug. We will see a lot from there. What the biggest changes, I think, is, and we touched on this earlier, is when you think, when you look at the concepts and the ideas we're following right now, the most profound change, I think, is that we see obesity as a root cause and everything else as a sequel. So we see type 2 diabetes as dependent in most places. So, well, it has to be very careful though. Same for fatty liver disease, same for cardiovascular endpoints. And so this puts the metabolic disease, and that puts obesity somewhere center stage, which is new as a concept, and which puts a lot of effort and reroutes a lot of money into this area and everything. And we will see those massive changes kind of fueled by this over the coming years. And I already mentioned that then we already start to see massive cardiovascular benefits from all those treatments. And I think that for me as a cardiovascular physiologist, that's the greatest news of all. And so I think I hope that kind of answers your question, but there's a lot of innovation coming, and they all target obesity because all obesity is understood and seen now as the root cause, as that needs to be targeted. And we're getting better and better with this.
Dr. Bolz, thank you so much for your time today and for your insights. Very exciting things happening at Aphaia, and we look forward to following and seeing what comes in the next couple of months, end of the year and into 2025. So thank you so much once again for your time today.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks a lot for the interview.
That's the end of this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.